Amesbury, England. The 30th of June, 2018. A woman named Dawn Sturgess stands in front of a bathroom mirror in a cramped flat above a charity shop, holding a small glass bottle her partner found in a bin a few days earlier. It looks like perfume. The box is sealed, the cellophane still crisp, the brand a name she half recognizes, Nina Ricci, Premier Jour. She works the modified nozzle with her thumb until it gives, and she sprays it on her wrists the way any woman would on any Saturday afternoon. Within minutes, her hands will not work. Within an hour, she cannot speak. Within days, she will be dead, poisoned by a nerve agent so lethal that a few molecules can stop a human heart. An agent built in a Soviet weapons laboratory, smuggled across an international border by 2 military intelligence officers, and meant, from the very beginning, for a man Dawn Sturgess had never met and never would. How does a 44-year-old mother of 3 end up dead from a weapon designed to kill a Cold War defector she had no connection to whatsoever? To understand that, you have to go back 4 months, to a park bench in a cathedral city 60 miles away, and to a Sunday afternoon when 2 people collapsed in broad daylight and nobody watching could explain why. Salisbury, England, the 4th of March, 2018. Just after 4 in the afternoon, a member of the public walks past a bench outside the Maltings shopping center in the heart of the old cathedral town and sees something wrong. An older man and a younger woman are slumped together, motionless, eyes open, staring at nothing. At first, the passerby assumes drugs. Paramedics arrive to find both victims unresponsive, pupils pinpointed to almost nothing, foaming faintly at the mouth, their bodies beginning to shut down organ by organ in a way that looks, to the untrained eye, like an overdose, and is in fact something far rarer and far more deliberate. The man is 66 years old. His name is Sergei Skripal. The woman beside him, 33 years old, is his daughter Yulia, who had flown in from Moscow only the day before to visit her father. Neither of them will regain consciousness for weeks, and within hours, British intelligence will already suspect what forensic science is about to confirm, that this was not an accident, not a stroke, not a batch of bad heroin, but an assassination attempt using one of the most dangerous chemical weapons ever synthesized, smeared, hours earlier, on the handle of Sergei Skripal's own front door. You have to sit with the strangeness of that detail. Not a bullet, not a car bomb, a door handle in a quiet English city famous for its 13th century cathedral and its water meadows, turned into a killing device by a nerve agent so potent that a residue invisible to the naked eye could put 2 people into comas within the space of a single Sunday afternoon. And the man on that bench was not a random victim. He was a former Russian military intelligence officer who had once spied for Britain, been caught, been sentenced to hang his future on a Russian prison term, and been let out early, in one of the strangest trades of the modern intelligence era, only to be poisoned on foreign soil 8 years later. Somebody in Moscow had waited nearly a decade to settle this account, and they had chosen a weapon that was never meant to leave a survivor. The first responders on the scene had no idea what they were walking into. Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, one of the first police officers to attend, went to the Skripal house later that evening as part of the routine effort to piece together what had happened. He touched surfaces inside that had been contaminated. Within hours, he too began to deteriorate, his pupils constricting, his skin clammy, his body sliding toward the same catastrophic failure that had taken down Sergei and Yulia Skripal hours before. A police officer, doing nothing more than his job, had been poisoned by a chemical weapon simply for stepping into the wrong house. He would survive. But his collapse told investigators something critical, something that turned a strange medical mystery into a national security emergency within about 48 hours. Whatever had struck the Skripals down was not a natural illness. It was still active. It was still on surfaces around Salisbury. and it was potent enough to fell a healthy police officer through nothing more than contact. Samples went immediately to Portondown, Britain's chemical weapons research facility, positioned, with a coincidence almost too neat for fiction, just a few miles outside Salisbury itself. Scientists there identified the substance within days. It belonged to a family of nerve agents developed in total secrecy by the Soviet Union, agents so obscure that most of the world's chemical weapons treaties had never even catalogued them, because the country that built them had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure the West never learned they existed. The British government would soon give the substance a name that had barely been spoken in public before that week: Novichok, Russian for newcomer, and the question detectives now had to answer was not only who survives being poisoned by it, but who in the world still knew how to make it, and why they had chosen, of all possible targets on Earth, a retired colonel living quietly under a British council house roof. Within days, the British findings were tested against an outside check that mattered enormously for how the rest of the world would receive them. Independent chemists from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the international watchdog based in The Hague, took their own samples from Salisbury and ran them without any input from British intelligence. Their conclusion matched Portondown's exactly: a Novichok-class nerve agent of high purity, consistent with a military-grade weapon rather than anything improvised in a garage or a criminal lab. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, because it meant the case against Russia no longer rested on the word of the very government making the accusation. A neutral international body, working independently, had confirmed the weapon. What remained unconfirmed was who exactly had carried it into England. It was not the first time such a question had been asked in Britain, and that history was exactly why the government reacted with such speed and such certainty. In 2006, another Russian exile, a former FSB officer named Alexander Litvinenko, who had become a fierce public critic of the Kremlin, died an agonizing death in a London hospital after drinking tea laced with polonium-210, a radioactive isotope so rare and so difficult to produce that a later British public inquiry concluded the operation had almost certainly been approved at the highest levels of the Russian state, naming two specific Russian men as the killers and pointing a finger further up the chain than either of them. Litvinenko took 3 weeks to die, wasting visibly in front of the cameras, and Moscow had denied everything then too. 12 years later, investigators staring at two unconscious bodies on a bench outside a shopping center understood immediately that they might be looking at the same signature: an exotic, hard-to-trace weapon, a target who had crossed the Kremlin, and a government in Moscow that had shown once before it was willing to kill on English soil and simply wait out the diplomatic storm that followed. To understand why Sergei Skripal was lying on that bench, you have to go back more than 20 years, to a man who spent half his career serving Russian military intelligence and the other half quietly destroying it from the inside. Sergei Skripal was a career officer of the GRU, Russia's Military Intelligence Directorate, an organization even more secretive and, in some ways, more ruthless than its civilian counterpart, the FSB. He rose to the rank of colonel, working for years in postings that took him across Europe under diplomatic and other cover, gathering intelligence for Moscow through the final Soviet years and into the chaos that followed the country's collapse. And then, sometime in the 1990s, in the years when the old Soviet security apparatus was being quietly renegotiated from the inside, officers uncertain of their pensions, their loyalties, their futures, watching an empire dissolve around them, Sergei Skripal made a choice that would define, and eventually nearly end, the rest of his life. He began working for Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, passing along the identities and operations of Russian agents active in Europe. For close to a decade, according to what would later be laid out at his trial, Skripal fed his British handlers a stream of names, operational details, and tradecraft that compromised Russian networks across the continent, all while continuing to serve inside the GRU itself, a mole embedded not at the edge of Russian intelligence, but near its very center, drawing a Russian colonel's salary while drawing a second, secret one from London. It could not last forever. In December 2004, Russia's FSB arrested him. He was tried in 2006, convicted of high treason, and sentenced to 13 years in a Russian penal colony, the kind of sentence meant to make an example of a man who had betrayed the uniform he wore. For 4 years he served that sentence inside the Russian prison system, one more name on a long list of intelligence officers who had chosen the wrong side and paid for it behind Russian walls. And then, in July 2010, something happened that briefly made headlines around the world and read, even at the time, like something out of Cold War fiction. On the tarmac at Vienna International Airport, in the kind of exchange that had not been staged in public view for decades, 10 Russian sleeper agents recently unmasked and arrested inside the United States. The deep cover network that included the young woman who would become briefly famous as Anna Chapman were traded for 4 men convicted in Russia of spying for the West. Sergei Skripal was one of the 4. He walked off a plane, a free man for the first time in 6 years, and was resettled by British authorities in the quiet cathedral city of Salisbury, given a modest house on a residential street, and, as far as anyone in the neighborhood could tell, allowed to disappear into an ordinary English retirement. For 8 years, that is more or less what he did. And in those 8 years, unrelated tragedy had already found him twice, in ways that would only look strange in hindsight. His wife, Lyudmila, died of cancer in 2012. Then, in the summer of 2017, his son Alexander, a 43-year-old businessman, died suddenly during a visit to St. Petersburg, his death recorded at the time as liver failure and buried quietly, without a hint of suspicion attached to it. Nobody in Salisbury connected either loss to anything sinister. It was only after March 2018 that people would look back at that string of family deaths and wonder, with no way of ever proving it, whether Sergei Skripal's ledger with Moscow had been quietly accumulating interest for years before anyone smeared anything on his door handle. Neighbors on Christie Miller Road knew him simply as a pleasant older man who kept to himself, who liked to drink at the local pub, who doted on his one surviving child when she visited from Moscow. He was, by every outward measure, a retiree, gardening, walking, growing quietly into the texture of an English suburban street, the way defectors often do, hidden in plain sight, not because anyone was actively concealing him, but because nobody around him had any reason to suspect there was anything to conceal. Salisbury itself is the kind of place where nothing happens. A medieval cathedral with the tallest spire in Britain, tea shops, a river, a population that measures its excitement in county fairs. It was, on paper, one of the safest places in England to hide a man Moscow wanted dead. And that was precisely the mistake, because whatever peace treaty existed inside Sergei Skripal's own head between his past and his present, it did not exist inside the Kremlin's. Spy swaps, in the tradition both countries had inherited from the Cold War, were supposed to come with an unwritten rule. Once a trade is made, the ledger is closed, the debt is paid. The traitor is somebody else's problem now. In March of 2018, somebody in Moscow decided that rule no longer applied to Sergei Skripal. The 2 men who would carry out that decision had already been living inside England for 2 days by the time the Skripals collapsed on that bench, and the trail they left behind, on hundreds of hours of ordinary CCTV footage, would eventually become one of the most detailed public unmaskings of an active intelligence operation in modern history. Now slow down, because this is where the story gets granular and the detail matters. On the 2nd of March, 2018, two Russian men flew into London's Gatwick Airport on a direct flight from Moscow, traveling on genuine Russian passports under the names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov. They checked into a modest budget hotel in Bow in East London, the kind of place with a shared corridor and thin walls, chosen for anonymity rather than comfort, the sort of establishment where two anonymous businessmen would draw no attention from staff or other guests. The next morning, the 3rd of March, they took a train from London to Salisbury and spent several hours walking the city, a reconnaissance trip, investigators would later conclude, timed to the day before the attack itself. CCTV cameras, mounted on shop fronts and traffic poles and railway platforms across the city, captured them repeatedly. Two men in dark coats, moving with the unhurried pace of tourists, passing within yards of the street where Sergei Skripal lived, pausing near the corner shops, retracing streets as though committing them to memory. Then they returned to London that same evening, having spent barely 4 hours on the ground. The following morning, Sunday, the 4th of March, the day the Skripals would collapse on that bench by early afternoon, the two men took the train back out to Salisbury a second time. Investigators would later establish that at some point that morning, one or both of them approached the door of Sergei Skripal's house on Christie Miller Road and applied a substance to the handle, a substance concentrated enough and persistent enough that hours later it would still be potent when Skripal himself touched his own front door on his way out with his daughter, bound, it seems, for nothing more dramatic than lunch in town and a walk. By early afternoon, the two men were already back on a train to London. By that evening, while Sergei and Yulia Skripal lay in comas in Salisbury District Hospital and doctors fought to understand what was killing them, Petrov and Boshirov were sitting in the departure lounge at Heathrow Airport, boarding a direct Aeroflot flight back to Moscow. They landed in Russia that same night. Total time on English soil, a little more than 50 hours. For weeks afterward, almost none of this was public. What the world initially had was a mystery. A poisoned ex-spy, a poisoned daughter, a poisoned police officer, and a British government that spoke with unusual certainty for an investigation still officially underway. Prime Minister Theresa May stood in the House of Commons within days and told Parliament it was highly likely that Russia was responsible, a phrase chosen with lawyerly precision but unmistakable in its meaning. Russia denied everything, mocked the accusation, and offered a rotating cast of alternative explanations. A British conspiracy, a laboratory accident, anything but the truth. And for months, the identity of the two men on all that CCTV footage remained the single largest open question in the case. While the manhunt for the two men quietly continued behind closed doors, the visible face of the investigation took over the center of Salisbury itself. Within days, the city looked less like a cathedral town than the site of a chemical disaster. Figures in full hazmat suits and respirators worked behind police tape at more than a dozen locations. The bench outside the Maltings, sealed under a white tent. The Italian restaurant Zizi, where the Skripals had eaten lunch that afternoon, closed and gutted for decontamination. The Mill pub nearby, where they had stopped for a drink, shut for months. The cemetery where Skripal's wife and son were buried, cordoned off out of fear that the two men might have visited the graves as part of their reconnaissance. Soldiers from the Army's Specialist Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Regiment were deployed onto the streets of an English city for the first time that most residents could remember, dismantling and removing the very bench where two people had nearly died. Ordinary residents, told only that a nerve agent was loose somewhere in their city and that they should not touch unfamiliar objects, began reporting phantom symptoms by the dozen: a tingling hand, a strange smell, a moment of dizziness on the high street, and each report had to be run down by exhausted emergency crews who could not yet know which of those calls, if any, might turn out to be real. The cleanup would eventually cost tens of millions of pounds and take the better part of a year, and for a city whose economy leaned heavily on tourists coming to see its cathedral, the sight of soldiers in gas masks working outside its shops did lasting damage that no invoice could fully capture. What the cameras had actually captured, once investigators pieced together weeks of footage frame by frame, was staggering in its completeness. A nearly unbroken chain of images tracking two men from a Moscow flight through a London hotel onto two separate train journeys, along the streets of a small English city and back out of the country again, all within the span of a single weekend. And buried inside that footage was a detail almost too strange to invent. On their first reconnaissance visit to Salisbury, cameras caught the two men walking near Salisbury Cathedral, apparently taking in the view of its famous spire, the tallest in Britain, visible for miles across the water meadows. It would return, months later, as one of the most surreal moments of the entire affair, when the two men finally agreed to explain themselves to the world. But before any of that, the story briefly seemed to end in triumph. Against every medical expectation, Sergei and Yulia Skripal began, slowly, to wake up. To grasp how close a thing that was, you need to understand what Novichok actually is, and why Soviet chemists built it in the first place. In the 1970s and 1980s, deep inside a classified program known as Foliant, run out of a closed military chemical site in the town of Shikani, Soviet military scientists set out to create a new generation of nerve agents specifically engineered to defeat the West's chemical weapons detection equipment and the international treaties then being negotiated to ban such weapons outright. Agents that in some formulations could be synthesized from precursor chemicals not banned under those treaties, then combined into their lethal, active form only at the last possible moment, in what chemists call a binary design. It was chemistry engineered around a loophole, a weapon built not just to kill, but to be undetectable and untraceable by the very systems the rest of the world had built to prevent exactly this kind of attack. The program stayed hidden for decades. It only became known to the outside world at all because one of its own scientists, a chemist named Vil Mirzayanov, broke his silence in the early 1990s, going public in a Russian newspaper with details of Foliant and the agents it had produced, and later publishing formulas in a book after emigrating to the United States, an act of conscience that turned Novichok from a rumor into a documented fact years before anyone sprayed it on a door handle in England. Even a trace amount of the substance, absorbed through the skin, can disrupt the nervous system so completely that the body simply forgets how to breathe. The Skripals should not have survived. Doctors at Salisbury District Hospital, working without a precise identification of the substance for the first critical hours, kept two comatose patients alive through sheer intensive care persistence, while lab results from Porton Down slowly filled in the picture of exactly what they were fighting. Ventilators, atropine, round-the-clock monitoring of vital signs that kept threatening to fail completely. Doctors improvising against a poison almost none of them had ever been trained to treat. Yulia Skripal regained consciousness first, in early April, weeks after the attack. Her recovery briefly became a strange front in the information war surrounding the case. Russian state media obtained and aired what it said was a private phone call between Yulia and her cousin Victoria in Moscow, a recording whose origin and circumstances were never fully explained, used to suggest that Yulia was being held against her will and denied contact with her family. British authorities insisted she was free, guarded, and recovering under her own wishes, and that the Russian embassy had in fact been offered consular access it chose not to fully take up. Either way, the leaked call was a reminder that even a hospital recovery in this case had become a battlefield. Yulia was discharged from hospital in the middle of April. Her father took longer. Sergei Skripal, older, more severely affected, remained hospitalized for more than 2 additional months before he too was finally released in May 2018. Alive, walking, speaking, a man who had absorbed a dose of military-grade nerve agent that was supposed to be unsurvivable, and had somehow come back from it. Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey recovered as well. For a moment, in the late spring of 2018, it looked as though the story might close there. A monstrous attack, a diplomatic firestorm, and, remarkably, no deaths. Yulia gave one brief public statement before disappearing entirely from view, a short, guarded appearance in May 2018 in which she described herself as lucky to be alive and said that her life had been turned upside down, that she hoped one day to return to Russia, and that for now she wanted only privacy to recover. It was the last the public would ever hear directly from either Skripal. After that, both father and daughter went silent, absorbed into a new, hidden existence that British authorities have never described in any detail since. That was not the end of the story, because somewhere in Salisbury, discarded in what investigators believe was either a park or a public waste bin by 2 men in a hurry to catch a train, sat a small glass perfume bottle still containing a significant quantity of the same weapon, packed, forensic analysis would later determine, at a concentration far beyond what was needed to kill 1 man on 1 doorstep. Enough, some assessments suggested, to kill several thousand people. And somewhere out there, that bottle was simply waiting to be found. While the bottle sat undiscovered, the world's attention turned to unmasking the 2 men who had left it behind, and what followed was one of the strangest press conferences in the history of modern espionage. By September 2018, British police and prosecutors had assembled enough evidence from the CCTV trail, hotel records, and flight manifests to formally charge Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov in absentia with conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, and the use and possession of a chemical weapon. Britain released the men's photographs, their travel itinerary down to the minute, and images of them walking the streets of Salisbury, an unprecedented public unmasking of what amounted to an active military intelligence operation laid out for any newspaper reader on Earth to examine. Almost immediately, Moscow produced the 2 men themselves, alive, unrepentant, and willing to talk. In an interview broadcast on the Russian state channel RT, Petrov and Boshirov sat before the cameras and offered an explanation for their presence in Salisbury that strained credulity even by the standards of Cold War cover stories. They were, they said, ordinary businessmen, in sports nutrition no less, who had simply always wanted to see Salisbury Cathedral, famous, they explained with straight faces, for its remarkable 123-meter spire and its ancient clock. They had gone once, been rained on, and felt compelled to go back the very next day to see it properly. It was an alibi built for people who had never expected to need one, and it collapsed almost the moment independent investigators began pulling at it. The unraveling came fast, and it came from an open-source investigative outfit that had made a specialty of doing what national intelligence agencies could not always be seen doing publicly. Working with the Russian outlet The Insider and eventually Reuters, the investigative collective Bellingcat cross-referenced leaked Russian passport databases, residency records, and flight manifests against the cover names British police had released. And inside weeks, the fiction dissolved entirely. Ruslan Boshirov was, in reality, Colonel Anatoly Chepiga, a highly decorated officer of Russia's GRU who had, years earlier, been personally awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation, one of the country's highest military honors, typically kept classified for operatives whose actual work could never be publicly acknowledged. Alexander Petrov was identified as Alexander Mishkin, a trained GRU military doctor whose medical background investigators noted would have made him precisely the kind of operative equipped to safely handle a nerve agent capable of killing the person carrying it. Both men, further reporting established, were tied to a shadowy GRU detachment known as Unit 29155, a clandestine formation whose operatives had also been linked, in the years surrounding Salisbury, to a failed coup plot in Montenegro in 2016 and the poisoning of a Bulgarian arms dealer named Emilian Gebrev, whose business supplied weapons to enemies of the Kremlin. Years later, Czech authorities would add another entry to the same unit's ledger, announcing that officers from Unit 29155 were also responsible for a pair of massive explosions at an ammunition depot in the village of Verbatice back in 2014, blasts that had killed 2 Czech civilians and were, for years, quietly attributed to accident, until the same GRU fingerprints connected to Salisbury turned up there too. This was not freelance revenge carried out by 2 rogue officers. This was a standing GRU sabotage unit with a documented pattern of assassination and destabilization operations across Europe, sent from Moscow with a fake perfume bottle and a decorated colonel's cover story, to finish an account that Vienna's tarmac in 2010 was supposed to have closed for good. And the men who carried it out walked home untouched, protected by a government that would never extradite them and had, evidently, decorated at least one of them for work just like it. Months passed. Salisbury slowly returned to something like normal. The Skripals vanished into the machinery of protective relocation, their whereabouts undisclosed even to this day. Reporters moved on to other stories, and roughly 8 miles away, in the smaller town of Amesbury, a man named Charlie Rowley was going through his ordinary life, unaware that somewhere nearby, a discarded box with a designer name on it was still sitting exactly where 2 Russian intelligence officers had left it back in March. Late in June 2018, Charlie Rowley came across a small box, sealed in cellophane, that looked for all the world like an unopened bottle of perfume, Nina Ricci, Premier Jour, a recognizable brand, the kind of thing that might plausibly turn up lost or discarded near any English high street. He picked it up, brought it home to the flat he shared with his partner, Dawn Sturgess, and thought little more of it. A small, unexpected find, the kind of thing you might give as a gift without a second thought. It sat in his home for several days. Neither of them had any reason to imagine it was anything other than what it appeared to be. Neither of them had any reason to connect it to a story from 3 months earlier and a park bench in a city they didn't live in. On the 30th of June, Rowley gave the bottle to Dawn Sturgess. She sprayed it on her wrists. Within minutes, Sturgess began to lose control of her body, her hands failing, her speech slurring, her breathing growing shallow and labored in a way that had nothing to do with any illness either of them recognized. Rowley, who had also handled the bottle and its contaminated nozzle, began deteriorating soon after. Both were rushed to Salisbury District Hospital, the same hospital, treated in some cases by some of the same clinical staff that had fought for weeks that spring to save Sergei and Yulia Skripal. By the 4th of July, laboratory analysis confirmed what doctors on the ward had already begun to suspect with a rising, sickening certainty. This was Novichok, the same weapon, almost certainly the very same batch, left behind by the 2 men who had flown home to Moscow 4 months earlier, believing their work in England was finished. Charlie Rowley would survive, though it would take him weeks to recover and far longer to comprehend what had happened to the woman he loved. Dawn Sturgess, 44 years old, a mother of 3 children, someone with absolutely no connection to Russian intelligence, to Sergei Skripal, to espionage of any kind, someone whose only mistake was accepting a gift from a man who had found what he believed was an abandoned bottle of perfume, never regained the ability to speak. On the 8th of July 2018, 4 months and 4 days after 2 GRU officers had smeared a nerve agent on a door handle in Salisbury to kill a man they had never met either. Don Sturgess died in hospital. Sergei Skripal survived the attack meant to kill him. He and his daughter disappeared into new identities under British protection, and to this day, their location has never been disclosed. Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey recovered fully and returned to policing. Anatoly Chepiga and Alexander Mishkin were never extradited, never tried, and have never faced any consequence inside Russia for what British prosecutors laid out in exhaustive, time-stamped detail. The Russian state has continued to deny any involvement in the attack. In the weeks after the Skripals were poisoned, Britain expelled 23 Russian diplomats identified as undeclared intelligence officers, and in an almost unprecedented show of coordinated solidarity, more than 24 other countries, including the United States, Germany, France, Poland, Canada, and Ukraine, joined by NATO itself, followed with expulsions of their own, putting the global total at well over 150 Russian officials sent home, the largest collective expulsion of Russian intelligence personnel since the height of the Cold War. Moscow retaliated in kind, expelling Western diplomats in matching numbers and closing a British consulate of its own. None of it brought back the one person in this entire story who had never had a single thing to do with Sergei Skripal, the GRU, or the war being fought over him, a woman in Amesbury who found a bottle of perfume and trusted it.